The ascending light dropped out of hyperspace above Osara Prime, and every soul on the bridge fell silent. The planet below was already wounded. 3 Drakari hive carriers hung in low orbit like massive black thorns, their hulls crawling with smaller vessels that detached and descended toward the surface in steady, unending streams. Fires burned across the northern continent, visible even from space, long orange scars on the green and brown landscape. The colony's shield grid flickered weakly, holding in some places and gone entirely in others. Smoke rose from the capital settlement in thick columns that reached toward the sky like desperate hands. Commander Yevrix stood at the center of the bridge, his scaled hands gripping the edge of the tactical console. His yellow eyes moved across the displays, reading the data, calculating the odds. Around him, officers from 4 different species worked their stations, their voices low and tense. The situation was worse than the distress signal had suggested. The Drakari had landed in force. Thousands of their ground troops, fast, armored, insectoid creatures that moved in coordinated swarms, were already inside the capital. Civilian casualties were mounting by the minute. Yevrix made his decision quickly. He ordered 3 strike teams to deploy to the surface by drop pod. The first team, led by a Thalron sergeant named Dreg, would hit the eastern approach and push toward the colony's central power grid. The second team, composed of Velinari sharpshooters, tall, pale, 4-armed beings with extraordinary eyesight, would provide covering fire from the ridgeline south of the settlement. The third team, a squad of Korvathi combat engineers, short, dense, heavy-boned creatures who specialized in demolitions and fortification, would breach the western wall and attempt to reach the civilian shelters. Humans were not included in any of the 3 teams. Cole and Amy watched the deployment orders scroll across the medical bay's tactical display and said nothing. Amy tightened her jaw and turned back to her work, sorting trauma kits with sharp, controlled movements. Cole pulled up the helmet cam feeds on the secondary monitor and sat down to watch. The drop pods launched. The feeds came alive with shaking images and the roar of atmospheric entry. Cole watched as the pods hit the surface and the strike teams poured out into the smoke and dust of the ruined colony. For the first few minutes, things went well. The Thalron shock troops pushed forward with brutal efficiency, their heavy armor shrugging off the smaller Drakari weapons. The Velinari found their positions on the ridge and began picking off enemy targets with long-range plasma rifles. The Korvathi blew a clean hole through the western wall and moved inside. Then the fire came. The ground itself seemed to split open in places, and from the cracks came waves of heat so intense that the camera feeds distorted and blurred. The Drakari had deployed something new, a thermal pulse network, a system of underground emitters that superheated the air in targeted zones, creating walls and corridors of flame that reached temperatures above 1200 degrees. The fire did not spread naturally. It moved in precise, controlled patterns, cutting off paths, trapping soldiers, and turning the battlefield into a maze of burning death. The effect on the coalition forces was immediate and devastating. The Thalron, for all their size and strength, were cold-blooded. Their bodies began to shut down above 300 degrees. Cole watched on the feed as Sergeant Dreg stumbled, his movements becoming slow and uncoordinated, his squad falling around him like statues toppling over. The Velinari, whose nervous systems were extremely sensitive to temperature changes, lost consciousness within seconds of the heat reaching their position. They dropped where they stood, rifles clattering to the ground. The Korvathi fared slightly better. Their thick skin and dense bone offered some protection. But their armor began to warp and fuse in the extreme heat, locking their joints and turning their suits into prisons. In the span of 8 minutes, all 3 strike teams were either incapacitated or pinned down. The worst of it was the first team. Sergeant Dreg and 43 coalition soldiers, Falron, Velinari, and Korvathi, had pushed deep into the settlement when the thermal network activated around them. They were now trapped inside a collapsed civic building, surrounded on all sides by a ring of fire that no living thing in the Accord could cross. The heat barrier was 200 meters wide in every direction. The temperature at its center exceeded 1,000 degrees. On the bridge of the ascending light, Commander Yevrix demanded options. His officers gave him none that worked. Orbital bombardment would kill the trapped soldiers along with the enemy. Shuttle extraction was impossible. The heat would destroy any aircraft that flew through the barrier. Sending more ground troops was pointless, because no species in the Accord could survive the thermal zone long enough to cross it. The comms filled with the sounds of the dying and the desperate. Soldiers called for help that was not coming. A young Velinari sniper, barely conscious, whispered a prayer in her own language. A Korvathi engineer, his armor fused to his body, screamed until his voice gave out. Sergeant Dreg, fighting to stay awake as his cold blood thickened in his veins, managed one final transmission to the ship. His voice was slow, heavy, and filled with a kind of tired acceptance. "We cannot move. The fire is everywhere. No one can walk through that." In the medical bay, Cole stood up. Amy looked at him. She had known him long enough to recognize the expression on his face, or rather, the lack of one. He was calm, completely, unnervingly calm. His eyes were fixed on the helmet camera feed, on the image of the fire, and the soldiers trapped behind it. And something behind those eyes had shifted into place, like a lock turning. "What are you doing?" Amy asked. Cole walked to the equipment locker and pulled out a standard-issue EVA hardsuit, the kind used for spacewalks and emergency hull repairs. It was not designed for ground combat. It was not designed for extreme heat. But it had a sealed environment system and an internal coolant loop. And Cole had spent enough time studying the suit's engineering specs to know where its limits were and how far past those limits he could push it. "I need you to help me bypass the coolant regulator," he said to Amy. "If I reroute the secondary loop through the chest plate and helmet, I can triple the cooling output for about 10 minutes before the system burns out." Amy stared at him. "Cole, that suit is rated for 400 degrees. The thermal zone is over 1,000. "I know. You will cook alive in there." "Maybe," he said, "but they are dying right now, and nobody else is going." Amy opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She looked at the feed, at the fire, at the fallen soldiers, at the ring of flame that had stopped 3 armies cold. Then she grabbed a toolkit and started working on the coolant bypass. It took them 4 minutes. When it was done, Cole sealed the suit and headed for the shuttle bay. Amy walked with him, carrying a field medical kit she had packed without being asked. Commander Yevrix's voice came over the comm, sharp and commanding. "Lieutenant Whitman, return to your station. That is a direct order." Cole stopped walking. He looked up at the nearest comm speaker, and for the first time in his service aboard the ascending light, he spoke back to the commander. "Court-martial me when I get back, sir." He stepped into a drop pod. The bay doors opened beneath him. The pod launched, and Cole fell toward the burning surface of Asara Prime, alone. Amy watched the pod's trail through the viewport, until it disappeared into the smoke below. Then she turned, walked back to the shuttle bay, and began prepping a second pod. Nobody tried to stop her. Nobody said a word. The alien crew members in the bay just watched her work, their faces unreadable, and for the first time since she had come aboard, the silence around her did not feel like dismissal. The drop pod hit the surface hard, punching into the scorched earth 300 meters from the edge of the thermal perimeter. The impact rattled Cole's teeth and sent a sharp pain through his spine, but the suit held, and he was moving before the dust settled. He kicked open the pod's hatch and stepped out onto ground that was black and cracked, radiating heat like the floor of a furnace. The air above it shimmered and twisted, bending the light so that everything in the distance looked like it was melting. Cole checked his suit's readings. External temperature at his current position was already 640 degrees. The thermal barrier ahead was far worse. His modified coolant system hummed at maximum output, pushing chilled fluid through the channels in his chest plate and helmet. But even with Amy's bypass, the numbers were not comforting. The suit would protect him for a while. How long that while lasted depended on how fast he moved and how much the universe decided to cooperate. He started walking. On the ascending light, every screen in the command center was locked on Cole's helmet cam feed. Commander Yevriks stood with his arms folded, his yellow eyes fixed on the image. Around him, officers from 6 species watched in silence. In the medical bay, Amy stood with her hands gripping the edge of a console, her knuckles white, her eyes not blinking. In barracks and mess halls across the ship, crew members gathered around any available display. Word had spread fast. A human was walking toward the fire. The first 100 meters were brutal, but survivable. The ground crunched under Cole's boots, and the outer layer of his suit began to change color, the pale gray polymer darkening and bubbling as the heat climbed. Warning indicators appeared on his visor, yellow at first, then orange. The coolant system was working, keeping his core temperature stable, but the suit itself was starting to suffer. He could feel the heat pressing against him from every direction, not like warmth from a fireplace or the sun on a summer day, but like a physical weight, like the air itself was trying to crush him. At 150 meters, the temperature crossed 900 degrees. The outer shell of the suit began to blister and peel in long strips, revealing the metallic underlayer beneath. Cole's visor cracked in the upper right corner, a thin line that spread slowly, like a crack in ice. A new warning flashed red across his display: suit integrity compromised. He dismissed it with a blink command and kept walking. Every alien watching the feed saw the same thing, and none of them could understand it. A single figure, small and alone, walking forward into a corridor of fire that had stopped 3 full strike teams. Not running, not charging, walking. Steady, deliberate steps, one after another, as though he were crossing a street in the rain. The fire roared around him, a wall of orange and white that filled the screen, and inside it, the dark shape of a human kept moving. A Velinari communications officer on the bridge whispered to the officer beside her, "Why does he not stop?" The officer had no answer. At 200 meters, Cole's left glove melted. The outer layer fused and dripped away, exposing the inner lining, which immediately began to scorch. He felt the heat reach his skin for the first time, a sharp, searing pain that ran from his fingertips to his wrist. He clenched his fist and kept walking. The pain was real and it was bad, but it was also familiar in a way he could not fully explain. Humans had lived with fire since the beginning. They had burned themselves on campfires, pulled each other from burning houses, charged through flames to reach people who needed help. It was something his species had learned to carry. At 250 meters, the coolant system began to fail. The bypass Amy had rigged was never meant to last. It was a field modification, desperate and imperfect. The fluid temperature in the cooling loop climbed past its operational limit, and the output dropped by half. Cole's core body temperature began to rise. His vision blurred at the edges. His breathing became heavy and ragged inside the helmet. The suit's medical monitor registered his heart rate at 160 beats per minute and climbing. He did not stop. He did not slow down. 4 minutes and 17 seconds after he entered the thermal barrier, Cole Whitman walked out the other side. He emerged, trailing smoke. His suit was blackened from head to toe, half melted in places, with the outer shell hanging off in charred strips. The visor was cracked in 3 places, held together by nothing but stubbornness and the thin inner laminate. His left hand was burned, the skin red and raw beneath the ruined glove. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps, and his legs shook with every step. But he was standing. He was alive. He was through. The Coalition soldiers, trapped inside the collapsed civic building, stared at him as he came through the smoke. 43 of them, Thalron, Velinari, Korvathi, crouched behind rubble and broken walls, their armor scorched, their bodies failing from heat exposure. They had watched the thermal barrier seal them in. They had accepted, in the quiet way that soldiers accept such things, that no help was coming. And then a human walked out of the fire. Sergeant Dreg, barely conscious, his cold blood sluggish in his veins, looked up at Cole and could not speak for a long moment. When he finally found his voice, he said only, "How?" There was no time. He moved past the stunned soldiers and into the ruined building, scanning for the source of the thermal network. His suit's sensors were mostly dead, but the ones that still worked pointed him toward the basement level. A Drakari relay hub, a cluster of emitter nodes powered by a central energy core buried beneath the wreckage. He found the stairwell and went down. The basement was dark, hot, and full of Drakari drones. Small, fast insectoid creatures the size of large dogs, with razor-sharp mandibles and armored shells. They came at him out of the darkness, clicking and hissing, and Cole fought them with nothing but a standard sidearm and his burned left fist. He shot 3 of them in the narrow corridor. A 4th latched onto his leg, and he kicked it into the wall hard enough to crack its shell. A 5th bit into his shoulder, piercing what remained of his suit, and he grabbed it by the head and slammed it against the floor until it stopped moving. He reached the relay hub, bleeding, burned, and running on emergency oxygen. The hub was a pulsing mass of Drakari technology, organic and mechanical fused together, humming with energy. Cole pulled the last explosive charge from his belt, a standard breaching charge meant for doors and light walls, and pressed it against the core of the hub. He set the timer for 15 seconds, turned, and ran. The explosion was not large, but it was enough. The relay hub shattered, and with it, the signal that powered the thermal emitter network. Across the battlefield, the walls of fire flickered, sputtered, and died. The ring of flame that had trapped 43 soldiers dissolved into smoke and fading heat. On the ascending light, the tactical display updated in real time. The thermal zones collapsed one by one, their indicators blinking from red to gray. Commander Yevrix leaned forward, his clawed hands pressed flat on the console, and for the first time in his long career, he had no words. Amy launched her drop pod the moment the perimeter fell. She hit the ground running, field medical kit over her shoulder, and fought her way through the smoke and debris to reach the trapped soldiers. She found them emerging from the building, dazed and disoriented, some of them carrying wounded comrades. Coalition reinforcements were already pouring through the corridors that had been sealed by fire minutes before. The Drakari ground forces, suddenly exposed without their thermal shield, began to fall back under the renewed assault. Amy found Cole slumped against the wreckage of the relay hub in the basement. He was sitting on the ground, his back against a broken wall, his ruined suit still smoking. His left hand was cradled against his chest. His eyes were half closed. His skin was flushed red and covered in sweat, and his breathing was shallow and uneven. She knelt beside him and opened her kit. "You are the dumbest man I have ever met," she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Cole managed a weak smile. Did it work? It worked. She injected him with a stabilizer and began treating the burns on his hand. "The fire is down. Reinforcements are moving in. You did it." He closed his eyes, and let his head fall back against the wall. Around them, the sounds of the battle continued. Gunfire, shouting, the distant rumble of coalition dropships landing. But in that small, ruined basement, there was a moment of quiet. Amy called for emergency extraction. While she waited, she kept working, her hands steady and sure, patching what she could. And as she worked, she heard something on the comms that made her stop and listen. It was not orders or updates. It was voices, dozens of them, in a dozen different languages, all saying the same kind of word. The Thalron said, Vrekar. The Velinari said, Ashenthi. The Korvathi said, Dulngor. She did not speak any of those languages, but she understood from the tone what they all meant. Ghost, Phantom, Specter, Wraith. They were trying to name what they had just seen. They were trying to find a word for a man who walked through fire and came out the other side. Amy looked down at Cole, unconscious now, his burned hand wrapped in gauze, his scorched suit still warm to the touch. She put her hand on his shoulder and held it there. They are talking about you, she said softly, even though he could not hear her. The whole galaxy is talking about you. Cole woke up slowly, the way a person surfaces from deep water, in stages, each one bringing a little more light and a little more pain. The first thing he felt was the cool pressure of regenerative gel wrapped around his left hand and forearm. The second thing was a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to live in every part of his body at once. The third thing was Amy's voice, somewhere to his right, saying something to a medical officer in a tone that suggested the officer was not moving fast enough for her liking. He opened his eyes. The medical bay of the ascending light was bright and humming with quiet activity. He was lying on a treatment bed, hooked to a dozen monitors that beeped and pulsed with data about his heart rate, oxygen levels, and core temperature. His left hand was encased in a gel sleeve that glowed faintly blue. His chest and shoulders were wrapped in thin thermal bandages. He felt like he had been taken apart and put back together by someone who was in a hurry. Amy appeared beside him. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and she was looking at him with an expression that was equal parts relief and fury. She crossed her arms and stared down at him. "You have been unconscious for 14 hours, she said. Cole blinked. His throat was dry. Did everyone make it out? 41 of the 43. 2 Korvathi did not survive their injuries. Everyone else is stable, including Sergeant Dreg, who will apparently need 3 weeks of thermal rehabilitation before his blood chemistry returns to normal. She paused. He asked about you twice. Cole processed this. He tried to sit up, and Amy put a hand on his chest and pushed him back down with no effort at all. Do not even think about it, she said. You have second-degree burns on your left hand, moderate heat damage to your lungs, and your core temperature was 106 degrees when I pulled you out of that basement. You are staying in this bed until I say otherwise. He did not argue. He lay there and looked at the ceiling and listened to the steady beeping of the monitors. After a while, he asked, How much trouble am I in? Amy's expression shifted. Something complicated moved behind her eyes. Amusement, maybe, or something closer to disbelief. That depends on how you define trouble, she said. She pulled a chair over and sat down beside him. Your helmet cam footage has been viewed by every command center in the Coalition. It went out on the Fleet Communication Network within an hour of the battle. By the time you were in surgery, it had been accessed over 2 million times. Cole stared at her. 2 million. As of 6 hours ago. It is probably higher now. She leaned forward. Cole, every species in the Accord watched you walk through that fire. Every single one. The Thalron War College has already added it to their tactical archives. The Velinari ambassador sent a formal inquiry to the human delegation asking how you survived. 3 separate news networks in the inner systems are running the footage on continuous loop. Cole closed his eyes. This was not what he had wanted. He had not walked into that fire to become famous. He had walked into it because 43 people were dying, and nobody else could reach them. That was it. That was the entire calculation. "I just did what needed to be done," he said. Amy looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something that he would remember for the rest of his life. "That is exactly why they are scared of us, Cole. We do what needs doing, and then we shrug about it." Commander Yevriks came to see him the next morning. The Thalron officer had to duck to fit through the medical bay door, and his heavy footsteps made the equipment rattle on the shelves. He walked to Cole's bedside and stood there in silence, his yellow eyes unreadable, his massive scaled hands hanging at his sides. The medical staff gave him a wide berth. Nobody spoke. Cole looked up at him and waited. He expected a reprimand, or at least a formal notification of disciplinary proceedings. He had disobeyed a direct order from his commanding officer during a combat operation. In any military, on any world, that was a serious offense. Yevriks did not speak for a long time. He seemed to be searching for something, the right words maybe, or the willingness to say them. Finally, he reached out and placed his clawed hand on Cole's shoulder. The weight of it was enormous, like a stone pressing down, but the touch was careful, deliberate, almost gentle. He spoke a phrase in the Thalron language. The words were deep and rough, and Cole did not understand them. But the medical officer nearby, a Velinari woman who spoke 7 languages, translated in a quiet voice. "You have carried what I could not. I owe you the weight of it." It was a Thalron phrase of debt honor, the officer explained later. It was spoken between warriors, and only when one had done something the other physically could not. In 300 years of coalition service, no Thalron commander had ever spoken it to a human. Yevriks held Cole's gaze for a moment longer, then turned and left without another word. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy and slow, and the silence he left behind felt different from any silence Cole had experienced on the ship before. It was not the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of being seen. The days that followed were strange and uncomfortable for Cole. He healed quickly. Humans always did, which was one of the few things the other species found genuinely impressive about them. And within a week, he was back on his feet, moving carefully, his left hand still wrapped in a light bandage. But the ship around him had changed, or rather, the way people on the ship looked at him had changed. Alien crew members who had never spoken to him before nodded to him in the corridors. Thalron soldiers who had once looked through him as though he were invisible now stepped aside when he passed, a small gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. A Korvathi engineer stopped him in the mess hall and thanked him in broken common tongue. Her brother had been one of the soldiers trapped in the building. A Velinari pilot left a small crystal on his bunk, a traditional gift given to those who had earned honor in battle. Cole did not know what to do with any of it. He thanked the people who spoke to him, accepted the crystal with a nod, and continued eating alone in the corner of the mess hall. Amy sat with him and watched the changes happening around them with sharp, observant eyes. Meanwhile, the footage traveled farther than Cole could have imagined. The Coalition High Command reviewed it in a formal session. Military analysts from 12 species studied his movements, his suit modifications, his decision-making under pressure. Diplomats discussed the political implications. For 3 centuries, humans had been considered the weakest link in the accord, tolerated, protected, kept safely in the back. Now every species had watched a single human do what none of their soldiers could. The Drakari noticed too. Coalition intelligence intercepted a series of encrypted Drakari tactical communications in the weeks following the battle. The Dominion had been monitoring the Coalition's comm networks, as they always did, and they had seen the footage. For the first time in recorded history, The Drakari updated a species threat classification based on the actions of a single individual. Their internal reports referred to Cole as a heat-immune anomaly, and flagged all human soldiers for reassessment. Commanders were warned not to assume that the thermal pulse network would be effective against human targets. Among the coalition species, something else was happening. A name was forming, the way names do in wartime, organically, passed from mouth to mouth, from ship to ship, from world to world. The Velinari, whose language had no existing word for ghost, created a new one. They called it Ashenthi Vel, which meant a shadow on the battlefield that cannot be killed. The Korvathi shortened it to their own equivalent. The Thalron adopted a version that fit their rough, heavy tongue. And when it was finally translated into Trade Common, the shared language of the Accord, it became two words that would follow Cole Whitman for the rest of his life. Specter of War. Cole heard the name for the first time from Amy, who read it off a fleet-wide intelligence summary while they sat in the mess hall. He looked at her, then looked down at his food, and said nothing for a long time. "I do not want a title," he said finally. Amy shrugged. "Too late. You have one." A week later, a formal summons arrived for Cole from the Coalition War Council on the station world of Harith. He was not being court-martialed. He was not being disciplined. He was being asked to appear before the council as a representative of humanity, to speak about what had happened, what it meant, and what humans were capable of. For the first time in 40 years of membership in the Valith Accord, humans were being invited to the table. Not as observers, not as guests, as equals. Cole read the summons, folded it, and put it in his pocket. Amy asked him if he was nervous. He thought about it. "A little," he said, "but I have walked through worse." Harith Station hung in the emptiness between two star systems, like a city made of glass and metal. It was the diplomatic heart of the Valith Accord, a massive structure, kilometers across, with docking bays large enough to hold warships and corridors wide enough for the tallest species in the coalition to walk side by side. Delegates from 12 civilizations lived and worked here, surrounded by the constant hum of translation systems, the quiet chime of diplomatic protocols, and the faint smell of recycled air that carried traces of a dozen different atmospheres. Cole arrived aboard a coalition transport shuttle, wearing a fresh uniform that felt stiff and unfamiliar after weeks in medical wraps and loose clothing. His left hand was mostly healed, but the skin was still pink and tight, and he kept flexing his fingers out of habit, testing the range of motion. Amy walked beside him, dressed in her own uniform, her medical kit slung over one shoulder, out of what Cole suspected was pure stubbornness rather than necessity. They were met at the docking bay by Captain Nate Harlow, a career diplomat who had spent the last 12 years trying to get humanity taken seriously within the Accord. Harlow was in his mid-40s, with graying hair, and the kind of calm, measured voice that came from years of sitting in rooms where every word carried the weight of policy. He shook Cole's hand carefully, glanced at the healing burns, and said, "Lieutenant, I want you to know that the next hour will determine humanity's place in this coalition for the next 100 years." Cole nodded. Harlow continued, "I have been working toward this moment for a very long time. I need you to speak clearly, speak honestly, and, if at all possible, not say anything reckless." Amy coughed quietly behind them. Cole said, "I will do my best, sir." Harlow studied him for a moment, the way a man studies a tool he is not entirely sure about, and then nodded. "That will have to be enough." The War Council chamber was a vast circular room at the center of Harith Station, tiered like an amphitheater, with a raised platform at the center, where speakers addressed the assembly. The seats were filled with representatives of all 12 Accord species, Thalron generals in their dark armor, Velinari admirals in flowing silver robes, Korvathi engineers in heavy work dress, and delegations from 8 other civilizations that Cole had only ever seen in briefings and photographs. The air was thick with the hum of translation devices, each one converting the speaker's words into a dozen languages simultaneously. Cole walked to the platform alone. The room was quiet. Hundreds of eyes, some yellow, some black, some with no pupils at all, watched him cross the floor. He was the smallest person in the room by a considerable margin, and he was aware of it. He climbed the 3 steps to the speaking platform, stood at the center, and looked out at the assembly. A Thalron moderator, an old scarred officer with one missing eye, formally asked Cole to recount the events on Osara Prime, for the record. Cole did so. He spoke plainly, without drama or embellishment, in the simple, direct language he had always used. He described the deployment, the thermal barrier, the decision to go. He described the walk, the heat, the suit failure. He described the fight in the basement, the charges, the explosion. He did not call himself brave. He did not frame what he had done as extraordinary. He told it the way it happened, step by step, and then he stopped. Then a Velinari admiral named Seleth, a tall, pale figure with 4 arms folded neatly behind her back, rose from her seat and addressed him directly. Her voice was clear and cold, with the precise diction of someone who was accustomed to being listened to. "Lieutenant Whitman," she said, "no species in this accord could have crossed that thermal barrier. Our physiology does not allow it. We have seen the data, and we have reviewed your suit's environmental logs. You should have died. By every measure we understand, you should not have survived. So I ask you plainly, what makes humans different?" Cole stood still for a moment. He looked at the Admiral, and then he looked out at the assembly, at the faces of 12 species who had spent 40 years thinking of humans as furniture, as filler, as the weak link in a chain of civilizations that stretched across the galaxy. He thought about giving them a technical answer, something about human thermoregulation or pain tolerance, or the specific properties of the EVA suit. But that was not the real answer, and he knew it, and he suspected they knew it too. So he told them the truth. He told them about Earth. He told them about a species that had been burning itself since the day it learned to make fire, and had never once decided to stop walking toward the flames. He told them about firefighters who ran into collapsing buildings while everyone else ran out. He told them about soldiers in old wars who threw themselves on grenades to save the people next to them, not because they wanted to die, but because in that moment, someone else's life mattered more than their own. He told them about medics who crawled on their bellies through gunfire and shrapnel to reach a wounded stranger, knowing they might not crawl back. They burned, just like everyone else. They felt pain, just like everyone else. They were afraid, just like everyone else. The difference, he said, was not in what humans could endure. The difference was in what they chose to do while they were enduring it. "We did not evolve to walk through fire," Cole said. "We are not built for it. Our skin burns, our lungs fail, our hearts give out. But somewhere in our history, a long time before we ever left our planet, we decided that some things matter more than whether we survive. We decided that the person trapped in the burning building matters, that the soldier bleeding in the open matters, that the stranger we have never met and will never know still matters enough to risk everything for." He paused. "That is not biology. That is a choice, and we have been making it for as long as we have been alive." The chamber was completely silent. No one moved. The translation systems hummed softly, carrying his words into 12 languages, and in every language the meaning landed the same way. Heavy, undeniable, and impossible to dismiss. Admiral Seleth looked at him for a long time. Then she sat down without another question. Commander Yevrix, who had traveled to Harith with his own delegation, rose from the Thalron section. He did not look at Cole. He looked at the assembly, and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire chamber. "I commanded this man," Yevrix said. "I assigned him to the medical bay. I ordered him to stand down. He disobeyed me, and because he disobeyed me, 41 soldiers under my command are alive today." He paused, letting the weight of that settle. "I formally propose that human forces be reclassified from support tier to frontline assault status within the Accord military structure. They have earned it. He has earned it." The vote was called. It passed unanimously. Not a single delegation opposed it. Not a single abstention. As the council chamber began to empty, Captain Harlow found Cole near the exit. The diplomat's face was composed, professional, but his eyes were bright, and his handshake lasted longer than protocol required. "Well done, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "You just changed everything." Cole nodded and said, "I hope so, sir." Amy was waiting for him in the corridor outside, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and a grin on her face that she was making no effort to hide. She fell into step beside him as they walked toward the shuttle bay, and for a while, neither of them spoke. The corridors of Harris Station were busy, with delegates and officers from a dozen worlds, and more than a few of them turned to look as Cole passed. Amy pulled up her datapad as they walked. "Coalition intelligence just forwarded something interesting," she said. "They intercepted a Drekhari fleet-wide directive, issued about 2 hours ago. Broad-spectrum transmission, sent to every Dominion commander in the sector." Cole glanced at her. "What does it say?" Amy read it aloud, translating from the intelligence summary. "Do not engage human soldiers in confined thermal environments. Do not assume human physical limitations match other Accord species. Reclassify species designation from negligible to severe threat." She laughed. It was a real laugh, bright and loud, and it echoed off the metal walls of the corridor. Cole did not laugh. He looked out through a viewport at the stars, thousands of them, scattered across the black like dust on dark glass. And his expression was quiet and thoughtful. "They are not afraid of me, Amy," he said. She looked at him. "Then what are they afraid of?" "What comes next," he said. "Because now they know there are 8 billion more of us." She looked at him, and for a moment the humor left her face and was replaced by something deeper. Pride, maybe, or the kind of understanding that only comes from standing next to someone at their worst and watching them choose to be their best. "Yeah," she said softly, "there are." They walked to their shuttle in silence. Behind them, the War Council chamber stood empty, but the words spoken inside it were already traveling outward at the speed of light, carried by comm relays and courier ships and the quiet conversations of soldiers who had seen something they would never forget. In the weeks that followed, a new shoulder patch appeared on the uniforms of human soldiers serving in the Valith Accord. It was simple, a dark silhouette of a figure walking through flames, with a single word printed beneath it in trade common: Specter. In barracks and mess halls and training grounds across 100 worlds, alien soldiers who had once looked past humans without a second thought began to notice them. They noticed the way humans moved, steady, unhurried, unshaken by things that would stop other species in their tracks. They noticed the way humans spoke about danger, not with bravado or denial, but with a calm, practical acceptance that was somehow more unsettling than fearlessness. They noticed the way humans looked at fire, at pain, at impossible odds, and simply walked forward. And when a human walked past them in the corridor, they nodded. Not out of pity, not out of curiosity, out of respect. The galaxy had known peace for 300 years, and most species wanted to keep it that way. The Valith Accord was the reason for that peace, a coalition of 12 spacefaring civilizations that had agreed, after centuries of border wars and failed treaties, to stand together against any threat that rose from the dark edges of known space. Their combined fleets patrolled the outer territories. Their diplomats settled disputes before they became conflicts, and their soldiers trained side by side on dozens of worlds. It was not a perfect system, but it worked. For a long time, it worked. The threat they guarded against had a name, the Drakari Dominion, an empire of insectoid conquerors that moved through the galaxy like a slow plague, consuming entire worlds for raw biomass to feed their ever-growing hive fleets. They did not negotiate. They did not retreat. They simply advanced, world by world, and everything they touched became fuel for the next advance. The Accord had held them at the border for generations, but everyone knew it was a matter of time before the Drakari found a way through. Humanity was the newest member of the Accord, and by far the least respected. Humans had only achieved faster-than-light travel 40 years ago, which in galactic terms was practically yesterday. Most of the older species viewed them with a kind of polite disinterest, the way a person might look at a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. Humans were small, they were fragile, they lived short lives, and seemed to spend most of those lives arguing with each other about things that did not matter. The Thalron, a species of tall, heavily scaled reptilians who made up the backbone of the Accord military, referred to humans privately as glass soldiers, easy to break and not worth the trouble of keeping whole. Human soldiers served in mixed-species battalions across the Accord fleet, but they were almost never given combat assignments. They worked in medical bays, supply depots, and communication centers. They maintained equipment, filed reports, and stayed out of the way. It was not official policy to keep them from the front lines. But everyone understood the unspoken rule. Humans were there because the treaty required it. Nobody expected them to fight. Lieutenant Cole Whitman understood this better than most. He was 29 years old, lean and quiet, with short brown hair and a face that rarely showed what he was thinking. He served aboard the Coalition carrier Ascending Light, a massive warship crewed by 6 different species, under the command of Thalron Commander Yevrix. Yevrix was 7 feet tall, covered in dark green scales, and had a voice like gravel dragging across stone. He was a decorated officer, a veteran of 3 border campaigns, and he made no effort to hide his opinion of humans. He had once told Cole directly, during a briefing in front of the entire squad, that human beings were soft creatures with loud opinions and no useful instincts. Cole had said nothing in response. He had simply stood there, hands behind his back, and waited for the briefing to continue. That was the thing about Cole. He never argued. He never complained. He did his job, followed his orders, and spent his off hours sitting alone in the lower observation deck, reading old Earth military history on his datapad. He studied battles that had been fought thousands of years before humanity ever looked at the stars. Thermopylae, Stalingrad, Iwo Jima, Fallujah. The alien crew members who passed by sometimes glanced at his screen and saw images of primitive soldiers fighting with crude weapons on a single small planet, and they shook their heads. They thought it was sad. They thought it was quaint. They did not understand why a man living in the age of starships would care about wars fought with gunpowder and steel. Cole's only real friend on the ship was Corporal Amy Greer, a 26-year-old combat medic from a small town in Colorado. Amy was the opposite of Cole in almost every way: loud, blunt, quick to laugh, and completely unwilling to let anyone talk down to her. She had gotten into 3 separate arguments with Thalron officers in her first month aboard the Ascending Light, and had earned a reputation as a troublemaker. But she was also one of the best medics in the fleet, fast and precise under pressure, and even the aliens who disliked her admitted she was good at her job. Amy and Cole ate together most evenings in the far corner of the mess hall, away from the louder tables where the Thalron and Velinari soldiers sat. She would talk about home, about the mountains and the dry air, and the way the sky looked at sunset over the plains. He would listen, nod, and occasionally say something that made her laugh. They had an easy friendship, the kind that forms between 2 people who are both far from home and both tired of being treated like they do not belong. One evening, while they sat picking at their food, Amy said something that stuck with Cole long after the conversation ended. She leaned back in her chair, looked around at the crowded mess hall full of aliens who barely noticed them, and said, "You know what we are, Cole? We are the galaxy's favorite furniture. Always in the room, never part of the conversation." Cole did not laugh. He just looked at her and said, "Furniture does not fight back." Amy raised an eyebrow. "No," she said, "it does not." 3 days later, everything changed. The distress signal came in at 0347 ship time, cutting through the quiet hum of the night watch like a scream. It originated from Osara Prime, a coalition frontier colony near the border of Drakari-controlled space. The message was broken, full of static and panic, but the core of it was clear. A Drakari vanguard fleet had broken through the outer defense net. Ground forces were already landing. The colony's shields were failing. The ascending light was the closest vessel capable of responding. Within minutes, Commander Yevrix was on the bridge, barking orders in his deep, grinding voice. The ship's engines surged as it turned toward Osara Prime. Crew members scrambled to their stations. The corridors filled with the sound of boots and claws on metal flooring. Cole and Amy reported to the medical bay as ordered. They checked supplies, calibrated equipment, and prepared for casualties. Around them, the alien medical staff moved with practiced efficiency, speaking in low voices. Nobody spoke to the two humans directly. Nobody needed to. Their role was understood. As the ship entered hyperspace, Cole stood by the medical bay's small viewport and watched the stars stretch into bright lines. Amy came up beside him and asked if he was all right. He nodded. She asked if he was scared. He thought about it for a moment, then said, "Not yet." Commander Yevrix's voice came over the ship-wide comm, rallying the crew, listing squad assignments, naming the strike teams that would deploy to the surface. Cole listened to every name. Not one of them was human. He and Amy had been assigned exactly where everyone expected them, in the back, out of the way, waiting for the real soldiers to do the work. Cole said nothing. He turned from the viewport, sat down at his station, and opened his datapad. On the screen was an old photograph of firefighters walking into a burning building, silhouettes against a wall of orange flame. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the datapad and waited.